So hello, everyone. My name is Olivia McCoy. I am a book publicist and marketing associate with Smith Publicity. Excited to talk to y'all today and talk to our panelists. This webinar will identify the pillars of an indie publishing team and tips to maximize book launch results through partner collaboration, from design to production to publicity, hiring the right team members, helps authors, publishers, service providers alike prepare and execute a winning publication plan while following a traditional model on their own terms. Our panelists today, very exciting lineup. We have Corinne Moulder. We'll be dropping in their full bios and links in the chat. Corinne is the Vice President of Business Development at Smith Publicity. We are a book marketing and publicity agency. We have Bethany Brown, the president of the Cadence Group, a design, editorial, project management, and book coaching provider. And Gwyn Flowers, the founder of GKS Creative, an award-winning design firm. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
So without further ado, we're going to be jumping in. We've got three big topics that we're going to be discussing today: important considerations for independent publishing, as well as building your team and keys to successful collaboration and communication between team members. So let's get started. So first question, what disruptions, challenges are authors and service vendors facing today that affects the full team? And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see your faces.
Thanks, Olivia.
So Corinne, do you want to get started? Disruptions, challenges that authors and service vendors are facing?
Sure, I can talk about the elephant in the room. I know Bethany's probably going to have some more insight here, but right now there's a lot of printer delays. A lot of print delays and the global supply chain is really impacting authors across the board. And this is not even just with the independent track. So this is for any publishing team. They're kind of trying to navigate a lot of strange timelines. I know personally on our side, we're, with the best intention, gearing up to launch campaigns, and then we're finding out the books are delayed, so we're having to push back our starts. And I think, that's a really big consideration to consider. That's also then impacting another area, which we'll talk about today further, is just the pre-order strategy, because people aren't getting their books so far in advance. And with that, I think there's opportunity. So we're starting to see some more shifts around how early do you get started? Do you need a print copy to actually drive some forward momentum? But Bethany, I would love to hear what you're feeling on the printing lines.
So for us, that is the elephant in the room. That's the biggest challenge that we're facing. We used to be able to get proofs in, express 2-day, 5-day. It's all over the map, and that we want an author to always have a physical proof in hand before they are approving files, because things can change, things can happen. And so we are adding sometimes up to like a month in the schedule, and basically saying, hey, we're going to hope for the best, but we're going to plan for the worst. The other thing is, with a lot of books being sort of pushed back during the pandemic and pub dates getting pushed back, the length of time it's taking to get stuff done. Editors are swamped, copy editors, proofreaders, I know publicity, designers. And so being able to compile the team in a way that everybody has the time to execute on an author's vision, it's just taking more time. And then the last thing, I know this is specific to print on demand, but I know has been a challenge, is so much of the customer service in the POD industry is now very automated, email-based. You can still get some phone support at KDP. It's you have to plan on sort of the email support from Ingram right now, at least in the US, which is fine. They're doing an amazing job. It's just adding time in places if you have a challenge with a file or a discount or a question that you have. So for us, it's definitely printing is the lead, but it's also kind of the availability of building the team and building the team that you want, making sure that everybody has the time to work on your project.
Yeah, and Gwyn, what are you seeing from the design piece? What are some disruptions, challenges?
Most of it is schedule, with what Corinne and Bethany just said, that pushes my schedules all around the place. So yeah, just working with the schedules. You have to be flexible.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm going to skip around questions a little bit because Bethany, you were talking POD, print on demand, and that is, I think, going to be the focus for this Q&A today is for indie publishing and print on demand. So why do authors and publishers use both KDP, Kindle Direct Printing, and Ingram Spark? And in your respective areas, what are some of the pros and cons for publishing under POD model?
I can take this first if you guys would want. Typically, we recommend that an author utilize both KDP and Ingram Spark for a very specific reason. You want to maximize your profitability by using KDP for your Amazon book print sales. You're not dealing with the same discounts. You're going direct to KDP for your Amazon sales, and you're going to make the most money per copy sold by doing that. We also like to utilize Ingram Spark to increase your availability. And while KDP has their expanded distribution button, if you use Ingram Spark, you're managing, you're setting your own discounts, you're setting your own pricing, you're putting in your own metadata, and you're increasing your availability outside of just Amazon to brick and mortar, to IndieBound, to bookshop.org, to Barnes and Noble, to sort of that non-Amazon piece. And if you're investing in your project and you're investing in a wide publicity outreach, you want that book to be available as many places as possible. And both have very, very similar programs. You know, Ingram has a title setup fee, Amazon doesn't. One prints on 55-pound paper and one prints on 50-pound paper, and I would screw it up if I tried to guess that right now. So they are a little bit different, but you're going to own your back end. And the other great thing with print on demand is your availability to make revisions. It happens that this happened to us a couple years ago. Someone called and said, I spelled my wife's name wrong in the acknowledgments. And we're like, you know what, we get that fixed for you right away. And so the ability to not say you've 1,000 books sitting in a warehouse, we have to sell through them all. And so that's one of the big advantages of using print on demand. It's a higher per print cost, but your overall upfront costs are significantly less because you're not dealing with big print runs. You're not dealing with warehousing, distribution. And KDP and Ingram Spark have the ability to push that book out worldwide for you. And that's a real benefit for indie authors. And PODs come a really long way. The other thing with print on demand, and we'll just touch on it briefly, is through Ingram Spark, you have pre-order capabilities for your paperback and your hardcover and your ebook. Actually, through KDP, you have pre-order capabilities for your ebook. And so that is a big support mechanism as you build your team if that's an important piece of the PR side of things. So that's sort of why we recommend print on demand. The quality's come a long way. There's certainly some challenges in terms of the automated systems, the customer service, some of the limits and what formats. And Gwyn can talk about that a little bit more. I don't want to overstep there. There are some limitations on what you can do, but there's also so much potential, and it's come a long way to utilize print on demand to support an entire team and an aggressive PR outreach.
Yeah, and actually Corinne and I were discussing earlier, we came up with a lot of the same points for benefits for print on demand. And before I turn it over to you, Corinne, in the chat, I'm seeing some people comment about, I know we're using a lot of terminology, Ingram, POD, KDP, all of that stuff. Feel free to ask questions throughout this webinar. We're going to be collecting them. We have a Q&A at the end. You can also feel free to help each other out in defining things. We have someone on the back end monitoring the chat too that can help. So Corinne, what would you say are some of the pros and cons for POD publishing from a marketing publicity standpoint?
Yeah, pros and cons, and just to piggyback off of Bethany, POD really has come a long way. I think Smith Publicity, we really cut our teeth working with independent authors. I started here, almost 15 years ago, and we still really celebrate the great knowledge that we get from authors who are paving their own path. And what's exciting, I know this is part of Bethany's rhetoric, you really can follow kind of a traditional model with your own control. So I have a few pros, definitely on the timing. Purely from a publicity standpoint, when it does come to independent publishing, we do have some recommendations that we offer. Even in prep for our webinar, we were discussing, if you're launching your book as a tie-in for Valentine's Day, well, you can't just start from standing still. So you have to get the momentum rolling. You have to have your pre-order up. And what you can do there is really identify the tie-ins where concepts from your book are going to be even more readily discussed across the media. we're kind of big fans about awareness months, seasonal tie-ins, holidays. So, for a project that might be talking about, mental health and veterans, we may recommend, a fall release around Veterans Day, where then we can build that momentum leading into it. I think also there is the panic at the end of the year, where you want to, maybe it's a goal, you wanted to get your book out, in 2022, but we have some parameters that we recommend, kind of not tipping into late October through to December, because then you're carrying a copyright date into the new year that might age your book a little bit. So to have that control over the timing really does make a difference in how you will build out your overall publishing plan. Something I love about independent publishing in general is the control over genre mashups. I think, there is the influence of spirituality when it comes to certain leadership books, or there may be a memoir element within a fiction work. So when you can really build yourself in as an author into the story, you're thinking through how to build your brand in there, you're going to have that opportunity to keep in what feels best for you and for your brand without someone kind of coming in to say, well, we have to take this out, because you're essentially, turning your manuscript over when you go that traditional track. And then to the point Bethany had brought up is making changes on the fly. A lot of times with POD and independent publishing, you may not have that front end timeline to really build out endorsement support, to get those early blurbs. And with POD, you can then add those later as they're coming in. You can make changes as you're getting reviewer and reader feedback to potentially lean into certain topics a bit more. So we do like that interchangeability that you have there. I think some of the big things to consider, kind of under the con list, but just more so bigger considerations around POD, is for authors who are really going to be leveraging bulk purchase strategies. These are our thought leaders, speakers who are leaning into monetizing their book through, maybe they have a webinar that they offer, a course where you have to purchase the book. There are marketing partners who can help to diversify the bulk order. But under the POD model, that's not something that would be readily available. So if going into the process, you have a big network list that you're going to be leaning into, from the standpoint of encouraging those bulk orders, that's a big consideration of which track to take. You are going to have a little bit more of a limited pre-order. I believe it's a 90-day window with POD and Ingram and KDP, right? That you'd have that 90-day prior. So if you are really considering major long lead outreach, garnering traditional reviews, these are just things to think about. There's always a caveat, potentially adding a page to your website where you can work around the book not being available for pre-order directly through Amazon, but that is a bigger consideration that we're always looking for.
And then, Gwyn, is there any big benefit to going POD for design?
Oh, the big benefit is absolutely the time it takes. The turnaround time is much, much quicker than traditional. So Bethany and Corinne stole all my pros, but there are a few cons as far as I'm concerned. Coming from a printing background, POD is set trim sizes. There's a list you can choose from, and that's it. It's cream or white paper. That's it. There's no paper choices except for cream or white. There's no embossing and foil and deckled edges, French flaps, all that extra stuff that traditional presses offer. But I think in this case, sometimes it's better to have fewer choices, depending on what you're doing with your project.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're running out of time for this section, but real quick, any other thoughts on how goals tie into an author's publishing plan and when they build their team? Does POD affect timeline based on an author's goals?
It definitely does. I will say if book sales, and I think this is really important for fiction authors, especially because there is more of a lifeline tied to that publication date, where it can die on the vine a little quicker than a nonfiction book that's tied to a brand. So if book sales through earned reader engagement are a major goal, then you're really going to want to lean into having more opportunity on that front end to actually build the buzz. We do often equate a book release to a movie release when we're talking about reviews. You don't really see reviews coming out for the movie a month after it's been in theaters. It's kind of on to the next one and building that buzz. So I think that's a big consideration. And if used as a marketing tool, consider the need for access to tangible print copies related to speaking events, related to webinars, to panels prior to. That would factor in that equation of how early you're going to need print copies. You can certainly do that on an independent track, but that would certainly help you start to align with available vendors and start to build out that marketing plan on the front end. And again, just because we do, see so many nonfiction authors in particular who are bringing strong lists of their own network to the forefront, if you're planning to lean into your own network for driving early sales, then POD is a bigger consideration if there may be other options that would be more effective.
Yeah, and I do want to keep talking about this. A lot of the questions that I'm seeing coming up from this discussion are actually about timeline, which kind of flows into our next piece so nicely. So I'm going to move us on to building your team, who to hire, when to bring them on. A big piece of that is timeline. So let's start with a two-part question. Who in your publishing team should you engage first? And for further context, what is the ideal lead time an author contacts you individually before their hopeful launch? Keyword is ideal. And Bethany, I know you seem like you're ready to go. So
I would say, in an ideal world, I love that word. In an ideal world, you're building your team 8 to 12 months prior to your publication date. And I know that that's not always possible and may seem incredibly overwhelming, but that gives you time to reach out to PR and publicity, kind of put together your team on that side, find your designer, work with your editor. The process for a manuscript typically starts, or doesn't always, but a lot of times would start with a developmental editor. That's gonna be the longest part of the process. We typically like to hear from an author when they're about 75% through that process. And again, from that point, we would start working backwards. And I think for timeline 2, it's all about the content. There's not one size fits all approach, and every book is not the same. There's 225,000 word manuscript and there's a 30,000 word manuscript. There's manuscripts with dozens of photos, manuscripts that are straight text. There's so the content, because it's a lot faster to edit or go through the copy editing proofreading process on a shorter book than it is on a 518 page novel. And so the complexity is a piece of that. And then also, it doesn't have to be linear for your timeline. And that's always something that we really encourage. While we're talking to an author about design and PR and publishing goals and strategy, the copy edit could be taking place. The cover design could be on its way. The outreach on the brand building and the publicity piece could be, it doesn't have to complete step 1, go to step 2, go to step 3. Part of what helps with the timeline is when all of the parts are kind of moving along at the same time. And as long as your team is open, and I know we'll touch on that, communication, and really being on top of that schedule and sharing delays and sharing successes and sharing kind of where we're at, that makes a difference on the timeline. But it does really kind of come back to the content of the book and how long it is and how complex it is.
And Gwyn, I know design is having that book cover is a huge part of moving forward, especially with publicity and marketing. So I want to touch with you first. When should they be contacting you?
Well, ideally at the same time they put the rest of the team together. I want to know when the pub date is. I would like to know, what are you doing? Are you doing hardcovers, paperbacks, ebooks? Are you doing ARCs, pre-orders? Plus you need all of the collateral for marketing. That cover needs to get done and get done pretty quick so you can use it for your PR and marketing. So yeah, I would like to be in on the beginning, but at the minimum 6 months, give me time to to get it done and get it done right.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. And then Corinne, publicity.
Yeah, so I kind of want to touch on one of the the first part of that two-part question, which is who do you engage first or where do you start? Because I think a lot of people here are looking for that guidance, and not to be self-serving, but if you really have no idea of where to start, I do think it's important to begin connecting on the marketing and publicity side, because we're always, as publicists looking at everything from a brand perspective, we dive deep into the goals. And again, learning more about the goals helps us start to dictate which partners might be the right fit to keep us on a certain timing track, to keep us on a content track for the purpose of any design that we need to bring in. Having that vision of what you're wanting to accomplish at the end. A lot of it is working backwards, as we've kind of said throughout. That I think it's really important to have the brand vision as a part of all of the discussions that you're having. And for us, yes, longer out from your target publication date to get in touch, the better. So I would say for us, for activating campaigns, if you're really looking for that traditional push, you're wanting to get out there for the earned reviews, really activate your own network, we'd want to start about 8 to 9 months prior. And if initiating work, would be a more limited pre-order push that you're doing, maybe it's a drop-in title that you're rushing out for a certain brand connection. Actually starting the work 4 months prior would be beneficial so that you're building an actual buzz with media reviewers leading up to and through that pub date. We say a lot, it depends, because it does.
And we have this nifty slide with the pillars of a well-rounded publishing plan. And Corinne, since we're recommending that we start with publicity marketing as some of the first people to engage with, where should they go to look for their potential vendor service partners?
Yeah, so I think, some places to look would definitely be starting to identify some of your own competing authors in your own space, to reverse engineer to see any partners that they've worked with. I think it's really important to be on LinkedIn. LinkedIn has changed a lot over the years. Just look at our first webinar that we did in January. But I do think there are a lot of fiction authors on there, service vendors are on there, make connections there, kind of start to follow those trails. There are author and vendor groups. We work with Nonfiction Authors Association. IBPA is the Independent Book Publishers Association, and they even have a podcast that they put out. So to start to identify vendors that are working in the space that you need support is great. If at a loss, you could also subscribe to some indie publishing newsletters. Shelf awareness is fantastic. I know Booklight puts out some newsletters and blogs, and within that, you're going to maybe see some call outs to vendors that they're recommending or spotlighting, and can just get you kind of started there.
Yeah, and I know we all work so well together, so we're always recommending each other when an author asks, but Gwyn, Bethany, any other places that authors should look for building their team, or they should start with research?
Yeah, I usually reach out to people I know in the industry. This is what we have. This is what I need. Who do you know? Either that or I use Readsy or Upwork or some sites like that where freelancers are congregated and doing a lot of different things, not just graphic design.
Yeah.
And I think the only one I would add in there is on the editorial side, there's EFA, the Editorial Freelancers Association is a place to look for editors. Ingram has a very active author community Facebook group, and other authors that that you're meeting in writers groups and online groups you're in, or writing partner groups, I think is, who did you work with? Did you have a good experience, a bad experience? Who would you recommend I reach out to? I think, leaning on other authors or indie presses for recommendations. And then of course, like Corinne mentioned, within the team itself, hey, I've already got my PR team. Do you know someone I can talk to about cover design or distribution or project management or editorial, and kind of leaning as you build your team, leaning on their expertise in the industry to make some recommendations for you as well.
And I think to add to that, probably something we should have said at the beginning is how long we've worked together. Bethany, we connected, I think 10 or 11 years ago. And what I've always admired about Bethany is she's like a living, breathing pub hub. So when I met Bethany with the Cadence group, you can follow that model of the traditional model on your own time, and she's going to connect you to the right people. For the first few years we worked with you, Bethany, I didn't even know it was Gwyn who was doing your design. And then it was Gwyn who was kind of brought in. So, the fact that you rely so heavily on your own partners, but are always willing to step outside as well for the right, reasons, or because you're introduced to another vendor, through a project, I think is just, it's incredible to see where you can take it. But it is really leaning on each other where it comes to the biggest support.
Right.
I did see a question pop up a little earlier about budget. So I wanted to ask, how do the different areas of publishing charge? Is there an industry standard?
That's a great question. I'm happy to jump in for the publicity on the publicity side. For publicity, for our agency and for many others, it's often a retainer. There's not a guarantee of media results. We can't force people to write a review. We're going after earned coverage. So it's very much an editorial selection. And because of the time-intensive nature of publicity, the retainer model works the best. On the other side with marketing, where you're potentially bringing in the influence of promos, of giveaways, of advertising budgets, there is usually a labor cost that's going to be your standard retainer, and then a fluctuating ad cost that would come and go, a lot of times on a case-by-case basis, or to be confirmed with your team before, of course, they're just diving into the investment. But you would have more of a charge then to apply across the advertising and unique marketing spaces as well.
Bethany?
So I'm going to talk about a couple of different spots on the editorial side. Just because we were limited in the number of people we could have here, I can speak to that just a little bit. Typically, a developmental editor is going to charge by the word or by the hour. A copy editor typically by the word or by the hour, and a proofread typically by the page or by the word. That's kind of in our experience, and everyone's a little bit different. There is actually no set standard, but it's just kind of on average, that's kind of what we see. For project management, it's typically some type, or consulting, it's typically some type of either flat cost or hourly cost. And it depends on how you're building your team, how you're customizing it, in terms of what each piece kind of comes together. But I would say from the publishing side and the editorial side, it's by the word, by the page, or by the hour. From a project management side, it's usually flat rate or by the hour. And then just to touch on it briefly, one of the things you have to plan on in your budget are those author copies or the copies that you want. And that if you're printing print on demand, you don't have necessarily the sliding scale like you do offset. So you'll have a per unit print price for the books that you're ordering direct from, let's say, Ingram Spark or KDP after publication. Or if you're working with an outside third-party printer for back of room books or merchandise copies, they will have a sliding scale depending on kind of where your numbers are. But that's also something to plan and budget. And that's going to be based on the number of books you're printing, as well as kind of how big the book is and things like that. But you should always plan on that per unit print charge as something to consider when you're building your budget.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Is there an industry standard for design, Gwyn?
It's really all over the place, but cover design is usually a flat rate. Formatting the pages is usually a per page rate. That seems to work out best. I mean, some people do offer a whole package, but the per page rate seems to me a lot more fair for the author and the designer. So you're not charging too much, you're charging exactly what you give them. And then you have a lot of other charges, like for the ARC, for ACX audiobook covers, stuff like that. Those are usually hourly.
Mm-hmm. Great. I know we wish we could be more specific sometimes. It really does depend on the service provider, on the goals, on what you're looking to get done. So it's good to know kind of how it's charged though, so you can ask those questions when you are talking to someone building your team. And then once you have your team, we have the team built, we did the research, we've engaged the first person, when should a project manager activate hands-on team collaboration and early team collaboration? When does the team start working together? And what is at that stage that you're starting to look for in your specific focus?
This was a big question that we all kicked around in preparation for our webinar today, and we did land on a unanimous time, right? So I think we said it's about 75% through the developmental editing. You already have your team in place at that point, but that's when you're going to start to see the strategy calls coming together, the bigger team calls, the influence of, for myself, jumping on a call with Bethany, here's what the author's goals are, what are your capabilities, how could we start to align our timelines and our shifts. Personally, for publicity, we're not looking for the finished manuscript at that point. Clearly, it's only 75% of the way through developmental editing. We're looking for high-level content and concepts. We're starting to earmark the ideas that the author has for their marketing vision, what their end goals are with the book, so that we can start to build in the initiatives and the strategy for when we want to get started, what assets we would need in order to generate our early launch activity, and really just starting again to potentially lean into the influence of the timeline for the launch of the book as it relates to what's being discussed within that genre or within news that relates to the book.
And so for us, I do think that 75%, I mean, that is kind of when you start building your team. Now, for the production side, those early conversations make sense to have. It is print on demand going to work? Is it a coffee table book? Should you be looking for a traditional sort of distribution fulfillment outlet? Are you trying to do a lot of color? Is it going to be too, so to kind of understand a little bit about the content of the book and the goals to make sure that we would even be a good fit as a team member, or that we would say, you know what, this is just outside of our wheelhouse, but here's somebody else that might be a better fit with your goals. For us to sort of get started, we want to have the conversation early, but we do need a finished manuscript to be able to correctly quote out the editorial, the proofread, and the design costs. That's one of the most important things, and I think this will come up a little bit later, is we want to see your manuscript because we want to do a sample for you. We want to be able to help you build the budget out based on the finished product. But those initial conversations at 75% through will help us better understand if we're a good fit, if print on demand is a good fit, kind of get a better understanding of an author's goals, and either say, hey, you know what, I think we should stay in touch, or this type of vendor is going to be a better fit for you, and this is the direction I would recommend that you go.
I love it when we all have a unanimous answer. Fantastic. And that actually leads us to our next section, keys to successful collaboration and communication across team members. So let's talk about what an author should have prepared or be prepared to create when assembling their team and executing their publishing plan. I would love to hear Gwyn talk on this, because I feel like there's some assets, some ideas of what they should bring to the table when they talk to you, right?
Yeah, we like to ask them to cruise other books, go to the bookstores, get on Amazon, find your competitors, find what you like, find what you don't like. The color purple, some people don't like purple. We need to know that up front. So when we start designing, we have all of this at our fingertips, right? So that's the biggest thing. Tell us what you like and you don't like. And then the other is, tell me about your book. I want to know what we're designing for. We need the feel and the tone of what we need to be doing to get this across the finish line.
Yeah, so it sounds like competitors, kind of an elevator pitch as a minimum. What else should they come? Yeah,
I like to have the manuscript. I read it. I read most of them, except the business books. I don't read those. You have to read some of it, right? Because that's part of formatting pages. But some of the books that come through actually take me a tad bit longer to format because they're really good, and I'm reading them as I format the pages.
I love
Corinne,
that.
what else should they come prepared with or prepared to create?
Yeah, I think come prepared with a general idea of who your reader avatar is. You'd be surprised some people don't have the exact target audience in mind when they're starting to kick off, the early promotional ideas. So I think that's really important because everything's going to be geared towards how do we engage with that network and how do we engage with that audience. Definitely don't need to have a website prepared, but you need to have one by the time we launch a publicity campaign. So that's another kind of expense and consideration under the marketing and publicity umbrella. That does weigh into the design as well. So we would want to draw off of either the cover concepts to build that into the website or vice versa. If it's a bigger brand that's established first with the book as an extension, you want to see the synergy there. So the website definitely plays into the overall design. I would say brand-based social media platforms, you don't need to be everywhere, but by the time we're gearing up to launch, you do need to be somewhere. A lot of authors have that goal to build a community and to engage with their readers, so you have to give them an outlet to do so. And then the marketing materials, again, not necessarily that you need to create them, but that you're ready to brainstorm and strategize and talk through what those materials are going to look like. And that's where we may have a Gwyn step in and do something, additional that's in complement to the overall book rollout as well. And also an idea of your all-in budget. Period. It doesn't necessarily have to be set at the time of the initial conversations, but there's a lot of fun, shiny things that you can add to your book design, that you can add to publicity, you can add to marketing. And so to understand what your limit is really important, or else you run the risk of going over or just not accomplishing what you were kind of setting out to do.
Absolutely. Bethany, what do you have to add to the list?
So for us, the first question I always ask are, what are your goals? That's the most important thing. So is it, I just want a book for friends and family? There's a much less expensive way to do that. I want a book that I'm going to build a big team with. That's important. It's always helpful to me to at least have an idea of your word count on that initial phone call, because it helps me figure out, like, does your schedule or plan kind of mirror what the capabilities are? If it's a 100,000 word manuscript, it's going to take longer than a 30,000 word manuscript, and a longer book versus a shorter book. So the word count is always important. And I know we're focused on print on demand here, and that's the bulk of the authors that we work with. But also, do you have, what are your distribution goals? Are you going to want copies for back of room sales or for events or for merchandise, or sort of, I always start with the goals. And they may not, authors, you may not always know, and that's okay, but that's to at least be thinking about that prior to the call will always help us make recommendations on how to build your team, who should be on your team, when those team members should get involved. And then also, I always like to touch on format just a little bit. A 4-color children's book or a big coffee table book is a little bit different than just your 5.5 by 8.5 novel and black and white straight text. Or do you have a lot of photos, and are they the quality that we can use, or illustrations? And so I like to have kind of those bigger conversations, and it doesn't have to be nailed down, but it helps us recommend how to build a team and what are the vital pieces of the team that you're going to need to have moving forward.
That's some great advice. Thank you for that. And I want to ask now, it's a little bit of a controversial question, but what are some red flags to look out for when building your team? We're going to talk in a second about setting the bar for communication and trust among the team. But first, what do we look out for? What do we avoid?
I think
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Corinne.
I think a good question to openly ask any vendor or service partner that you're considering bringing on is how willing they are to share results, to share strategies, and really support those conversations across team lines. Because we have, we've worked with many vendors in the past, and not everyone is willing to share. But certainly we want to see, when we're looking at it from a publicity perspective, we think to maximize the results that we do, we share our results with everyone, because then on the distribution side, on the side of the website development, on social media, it all feeds into one another. So I think looking for vendors that are open to sharing results and strategy is one really important way to kind of identify your red flag. And the other, I think, is just general communication blips as well. You know, what cadence you're into with your rep, how fast they're responding, if they're open to sharing referrals and other, vendors that they've worked with. And I think that also feeds into another that I think Gwyn and Bethany will definitely agree with, and that's being willing to share other authors or clients that they've worked with in the space that you're coming from, because I think that's really important to align yourself with someone who has experience in that particular genre or concept.
And I think and I think we all three would agree on this, somebody that's willing to do a full pricing proposal without asking to see your manuscript or learning more about your project is generally a pretty big red flag. You know, you want to make sure that your team is as invested in your project as you are, but more importantly, I think it's real hard to build a proposal if someone's not seen your manuscript or looked at your book or has an understanding of your goals. And so I think that is most important. And just to kind of follow up a little bit on what Corinne was saying is, as you build your team, making sure everyone's on board with open communication, because that's what's really going to make it work. You know, is it okay if you send your first 3 cover drafts to your network to get feedback and opinions to send back to us? Is it okay to share with your publicity team or your results this way or that way? And I think that trust and that open communication, and if someone's very much unwilling to participate in a team, then they probably shouldn't be part of a team that you're building. But for me, the biggest thing is always someone's got to ask to see your manuscript, because that drives so much in terms of pricing, but also in terms of capability of, is this a project that we feel like we can be successful working on? Is this a project where we have a lot of experience? Is this a project where, you know, that's it's not quite ready, and it may need to go back to a DE or something? And so I think for me, it's always asking for the book, asking for the manuscript.
Yeah, same here. Ask for the manuscript, read it, see what you're getting into, be transparent with your pricing and communication.
And Corinne, I know we've talked before, anyone that promises a certain amount of results, anyone that decides upfront, we can do exactly this, we can get this coverage, it's pretty big red flag, especially for publicity and marketing. All right, then, so we know what to avoid. How does an author ensure that there's no overlap among the team, and setting the bar for communication so that everyone knows what they're doing? We trust each other to get it all done. How can an author help facilitate that?
I think scheduling those early meetings. You know, I think as soon as you have your team in place, even if you're not at that go launch, having a strategy call really makes a lot of sense. Making sure that your team is aligned and sort of on the same page. And then for overlap, and it can happen. I mean, some firms have very cut and dry package-based things. Some are more customized. Some can just do one piece or require you to do everything. And sort of as you get your proposals and as you're having these early conversations, kind of laying them out next to each other and saying, hey, you know, person A is going to be, I have my own cover designer. Is that okay? Sure. But so let's plan for that. So you're not paying for Gwyn to do something that you don't need to do, or making sure when you kind of line it up, is there any overlap? And I think it goes back to the other question too. If there is your team willing to kind of talk about it and say, you know what, this person's a better fit for that. So we're going to take that out of our proposal and kind of leave it in their space. And so it all comes back to communication. And I also think just outlining all of the pieces you need and comparing them among the proposals to make sure there's no overlap. And if there is, having the open conversation about how you can reduce that.
Can I just say ditto?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Are there any specific green flags, Gwyn, in design that you see as part of a team that you're like, yep, this is a team I want to work with, I feel good about this?
Oh, absolutely. Well, Bethany.
It's such a, making me blush.
We're all great friends.
She's really good at what she does, and we work really well together, and I'm having a good time with it.
Love that.
I think something too, just, when we're talking about project manager, we really are talking in most cases about the author, unless you're wanting to add that expense to what, might already be an expensive focus for you. The author is the one to coordinate it all, to bring it together. By surrounding yourself with the right vendors and professionals, you're going to be able to ask those questions. When should you and Bethany connect? When is the right time for me to be sending the mock-up book cover designs, which we love, and that's another flag we did talk about, is when someone's not willing to share that and have that influence from the marketing team. But for a project manager or author in this case, it's really important to set the bar for communication by not rushing vendors to speed up their work. Everyone's giving the guidelines of the latest deadline that you can expect, and they give that for a reason. And as we've seen, especially through the shift with printing, that's a quick way to have your team member, start to ruffle feathers actually across the team. If you're kind of going against what has already the expected timeline, the anticipated timeline, and pushing for something, in another area because you've learned of something new. So I think it's really important, before you're solidifying that team, to understand what the timelines are, so that you're not putting anyone in that uncomfortable situation of, well, Bethany, we do need books now, and that might not have been a part of that conversation to begin with. So I think be ready to default to initial timelines and initial initiatives is important. I think in the publishing industry and across the board, vendors remain flexible because we all say it depends about 20 times a day. So, there is flexibility to it, but at the end of the day, timelines are important. And I think it's also embracing the we mentality, getting behind a team who you feel is really working in support of the launch of the book. We're all in it together. A successful launch for the author is success for all of us. So to embrace that we mentality, again, that kind of coincides with not pitting any vendor against another as being a scapegoat for a timeline that, might have been extended. It's just really important to keep that in mind as you're having that frequent and open communication.
That's great. And I want to keep an eye on the time. So we're at 50 minutes. We're going to open it up for Q&A. Anyone that has to jump off, we will be following up with a link to the recording so you can watch it all over again, and a handout as well for everyone that's participated and joined in. I'm going to keep this slide up so you can see our contact information, but also let's get into the Q&A. I know there were some great questions asked throughout, and I want to get to as many as possible. So one of the first ones I saw, how far in advance before the actual publication date would you recommend having a pre-order page set up?
That's going to be driven by publicity, really. Yeah. I mean, I think that's our, we get that date from publicity and see how quickly we can match that date.
Yeah, and that also comes down to the framework under independent publishing, because again, if it's KDP, right, it's only 90 days. Is that right, Bethany? 90 days prior.
For the ebook, it was, I think they may have opened that up a little bit.
Okay.
But I'm not, don't anyone write that down. I think they may have opened it, but for a long time it was 90 days. And we're typically in that window. So I haven't actually tried to be outside of that window yet. So typically that's where we have fallen.
Yeah, and so if working under the POD format, it's going to be about 90 days on Amazon for the purpose of navigating reviews, early media outreach on your website. If you're using that as an alternative before the actual pre-order goes up, you're going to want that launched by the time publicity begins. So you always have a home base to direct media, reviewers, readers to learn more about the book and about you.
And then just from a timing perspective, to jump in here real quick, we can do an ebook pre-order with just the cover. We don't have to have the manuscript. There'll be a big deadline and a million emails coming from KDP of when they need the EPUB file. But we can do that without a finished manuscript, and we can do pre-order for print off a set of designed pages, but sometimes we do it before the proofread because it's not available. But you always just have to plan in your schedule to get the appropriate files where they need to be well in advance of your pub date. And so we can launch pre-order early in the process, off of the first set of pages, off of just a cover for an ebook. And then again, we'll go back to that timeline and say, okay, well, we want to have our everything buttoned up and completely finished 2, 3, 4 weeks, whatever the timeline we set prior to the pub date, to ensure that we're getting files where they need to be, proofs ordered, things approved before they start printing and shipping to meet that pre-order date.
And let's talk branding, which I feel like is going to be a good Gwyn question.
Oh,
Carl had to jump off, but I know he's going to watch the recording later. What have you seen work well for authors who are trying to use a book to help build their brand?
wow, that might be more of a Bethany question, but what works well?
Do you ever see branding?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, do you ever see branding design assets influence a book cover or vice versa?
Yeah, it's really hard to explain. You would have the colors matching, the branding stay on point with the cover and stay on point with any other assets that you have, like your website.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah, we
And if
like,
you have a series, there's frequently with a first book, we'll be setting a series logo or a series brand or a font style. And like, so some of the choices you're making for book one, if it's a firm series, you want to be making in a way that they're going to carry over to future books. You don't do something so out of the box that then you can't recreate it for the next project. And I think that comes up on my end, but also on your end, Gwen, when we're kind of strategizing trim size, logos, series sort of.
Yeah, font choices, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then Bethany, what do you think about the idea of doing both print on demand and offset printing in advance for people looking to become a major bestseller for lofty goals?
So it's a good question. So we actually sort of look at kind of a 2 or 3 tier strategy. The books that you're going to make the most money on are the books that you're printing direct and selling direct, because you're going to get a better price. So typically when we're looking at with like a speaker, for example, or a musician, or someone that's selling stuff through using the book to build their business, you know, we're kind of saying, okay, to go to the consumer, we're going to use print on demand. We're going to use KDP. We're going to use Ingram Spark for your print book. We're going to create an ebook for you. If you need 1,500 copies for back of room, we're going to quote that out at a different printer because you're going to get a much better cost savings. And you sort of have to plan on that. And, you know, in the scale, you make the most money per copy sold on the ones you're selling direct. You just have to have a plan with what you're going to do with those books once you print them. Then secondarily, you make the second most amount of money on the copies you're selling through KDP on Amazon in print. And third is Ingram, because you're dealing with the discounts that retailers sort of require. So you want to make sure you're remaining profitable across all 3 of those things. But that goes back to that working backwards, that initial call, that what are your goals? These are some of the things that come up at that time so that we can say, okay, well, we know you need 1,000 books. Where are we going to get them printed? What's the cost going to be? We're not going to put those through the POD system as long as you have a plan for them. But we're going to use the POD system, KDP and Ingram Spark, to reach Corinne and Olivia and Gwyn and someone that's going on to search for the book at bookshop.org or IndieBound or Barnes & Noble or Amazon. And so we kind of approach it a few different ways.
And then we had a couple people ask about beta readers. Do you recommend beta readers, and how would they find them? Do they have to sign an NDA?
Corinne, I'm tossing that one to you.
yeah, I'm not so sure about the NDA on that side of it. I know beta readers can be very supportive, and I want to throw the term out for sensitivity readers as well, as we have seen just such a shift in the social and political landscape. That's become really important to make sure that you're following a model, you're writing authentically, and that you're also really making sure the best and strongest concepts are landing on the right side with the reader. I did just learn about a new, to me, service. It's called betabooks.com. And I was invited to it through an author whose manuscript we were reviewing for consideration for building out a publicity proposal. And in that, the author was able to engage directly with everyone who she was sharing the book with. You could give feedback directly to the author within the program as well, so that she could start to capture any errors or ideas that were coming up across her beta readers. And I do think that would have to be on the side of when you're still in the editing process, so that as you're getting that feedback, you're actually able to incorporate it. How far in advance to activate the beta readers, I'm not entirely sure on that, but that's a good question to maybe take a look at.
Yeah. Lots of people were glad to hear Gwyn say that she reads most of the books that she works on. Is that generally true of marketing and publicity specialists as well?
Yes, definitely a deep familiarization with it. And again, every genre is different. Fiction especially, it requires a heavier read. You know, with business books, with self-help books, we're looking at the bigger concepts, what relates directly to the author's professional or expert background that they can influence then in terms of topics for media, for review leverage. So we have to have a deep familiarization with the book, and even deeper with the content when it comes to fiction.
Great. And then one more question. It was about Facebook. So I might take this one. I have my background is in marketing for independent publishing. Facebook, are we done with it? Is it losing popularity? Do we want to continue with Facebook? And honestly, I would say that yes, Facebook is actually still one of the most popular social media sites out there. We just got the engagement numbers for 2021, and people still use Facebook all the time, even above YouTube and Instagram. Each social media platform has their own specific goals and pros. Facebook is really good about creating groups and having people come together to network, strategize, talk on the same topics and discussions. It's also where you're going to see the most effective use of your social media advertising dollar. People go to Facebook to make purchasing decisions, read Facebook Marketplace. They don't necessarily do so for TikTok or Instagram or Twitter or LinkedIn. That's where they're going to escape or learn or network or whatnot, but not necessarily make those publishing decisions. So Facebook still has some time. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We're so excited to see you. We will be following up with the recording link and with a handout for you all to look over. We're so excited. Hopefully we get to work with each and every one of you in the future. Thank you so much to our panelists for taking the time to discuss today. It was so great to see you and hear from you. And we will all be in touch soon. Take a look, keep an eye out for the next webinar, and we'll be in touch.